Alright, so 4, 6 is on half-angle identities. I can use the half-angle identities to find the half-angle values. So you're going to have out your identity sheet, and you're going to be filling in that last little section on the second side of your identity sheet today. So just like before, we've started off with this on every single one of these. Does the sine of 30 there equal 1/2 times the sine of 60? Well, we know that the sine of 30, from the unit circle, we know the sine of 30 there is equal to 1/2. So let me write that down, 1/2. Right? We also know 1/2 times the sine of 60. So I'm going to write down the 1/2. And then we know that the sine of 60, again from the unit circle, the y value there at 60 is the square root of 3 over 2. And so multiplying your numerator and multiplying your denominator there, you get the square root of 3 over 4. And the square root of 3 over 4 is not equal to 1/2. So do those two equal each other? No, definitely not. These are your half-angle formulas. You have the sine of, it's 1/2 x, or x over 2 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 1 minus the cosine of x all over 2. So both the 1 minus cosine x divided by 2, that whole thing is underneath the square root. And then don't forget that plus or minus is on the outside, and you're going to have to decide, is it a positive or negative in your final answer. The cosine of x divided by 2, or 1/2 x, is plus or minus the square root of 1 plus cosine of x divided by 2. The tangent of x over 2, or the tangent of 1/2 x, is 1 minus cosine x divided by sine x. Or you could have the sine of x divided by 1 plus the cosine of x. Or we could do the sine of x over 2 divided by the cosine of x over 2. So make sure you copy all those down. So our first example here is to find the trig values from the given information. So we have the cosine of x there is 5/13, and they were told that x is in the first quadrant. So just like we've been doing all along here, we can use our Pythagorean identity here, cosine squared x plus the sine squared x is equal to 1. So cosine there is 5/13, and then we have to square that. So I can subtract off the 5/13 squared. So 5/13 squared there is, I can square 5 there and I get 25. I can square 13 there and I get 169. And then I'm going to probably get that common denominator there, so I can go ahead and multiply my numerator and denominator there by 169. Do the same thing up here. So really, 169 there, subtract 125 there in my numerator. I'm getting 144 over 169. Alright, and then once we have those, we can go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So I'm just going to rewrite this. So sine squared. Actually, I'm just going to write down sine x. So taking the square root of both sides here, we end up getting plus or minus the square root of 144 there is 12. The square root of 169 there is 13. So we get plus or minus the square root of 13. But really, since the x there is in the first quadrant, we know the sign in the first quadrant there has to be positive. So the sign of x that we're trying to find here is 12/13. So 12/13. So now we have to find a half angle identity here. So we got the half angle here of cosine here. So cosine of x over 2, or the cosine of 1/2 times x. We've got a nice formula for that. We have plus or minus, so let's write it out. Exactly what the formula says. There's only one formula for this one. So equals plus or minus the square root, and it says 1 plus the cosine of x. Well, we have the cosine of x. We know that the cosine of x there is 5/13. And then it says it's divided by 2. So then what I would do here is I would get a common denominator up there on the numerator up there. So common denominator is going to be 13. So that 1 becomes 13 over 13 plus 5 over 13. So adding your numerator and writing down that common denominator of 13. And then I'm also going to go ahead, and this is like it's over 1 down here. I'm going to go ahead and multiply by the reciprocal of what's down there. The reciprocal of 2 over 1 is 1 over 2. So now go ahead and multiply your numerators, which is 18. Multiply your denominators there, which is 26. And I'm going to reduce this down first. So if I reduce this down, I can see that both 2 goes into 18 and into 26 there. So I'm getting 9/13. And then think about square rooting this. I can actually take the square root of the numerator there, which is 3. I cannot find the square root of 13, but I can't leave my answer here with the square root down here in the denominator. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply my denominator down here by the square root of 13 to get rid of that. And so I have to multiply my numerator here by my square root of 13. So my real answer here then ends up being 3 square root of 13. And the square root of 13 times the square root of 13 is the square root of 169, which is 13. And all along in here, it's supposed to be plus or minus in this whole thing. I just wasn't writing it. And then we're going to have to make a decision about whether or not my answer here is positive or negative. Alright, so let's make that decision. Should our final answer here, it says it's in the first quadrant there. So if you're in the first quadrant there, and then you take half of the angle, so let's say like 60 degrees, and you take half of that angle, what angle do you have? You've got a 30-degree angle, and which quadrant is it in? It's in the first quadrant. So it's a positive values here. So I kind of want to walk you through that. So if you have the half angle there, and it's in quadrant 1, X, I think I'm going to do X up here. So X, if X is in quadrant 1, then kind of think through that. Then the half angle, X divided by 2, so anything that's in quadrant 1, and then you divide that angle there by 2, so I don't know, if you got 70 and you divide by 2, you got 35. Well, 35 is still in quadrant 1. So if the original angle there, X, is in quadrant 1, the half angle is also going to be in quadrant 1. Right? So let's think about a quadrant 2 angle. They told you that X there is in quadrant 2. What about the half angle? So let's think about that. So 120 would be in quadrant 2. Divide that by 2 and you're at 60. And 60 is in quadrant 1. So if you've got a quadrant 2 angle and you want to find the quadrant and you want to find the half angle of that, it's going to put it in quadrant 1. Alright. Now let's think about, what about quadrant 3? What happens if my angle there is in quadrant 3? What would the half angle there be in? So let's think through that one. So if they told you about a quadrant 3 angle, a quadrant 3 angle would be something like, what do we have? 200. 200 would be in quadrant 3. So 200 divided by 2 is 100, and that would put me in quadrant 2. Alright, so let's go to quadrant 4. So give me an angle there in quadrant 4 that you can think of. Well, let's think of, like, I don't know, 320. No, let's do 340. So 340, if you think about 340 there, that would be in quadrant 4. If you took 340 there and divided by 2, that is going to give you 170. Yes, 340 divided by 2 is 170. And 170 is up there in quadrant 2. So if you have a quadrant, if X is a quadrant 1 or in quadrant 2, then the half angle is always going to be in quadrant 1. If your original angle there is in quadrant 3 or 4, then your half angles there are going to be in quadrant 2. So you need to figure that out and know that. You cannot write that on your identity sheet. Alright, so let's come over here and let's look at the sine of x over 2. So the 1/2 of x. So the half angles there for sine. It is going to be plus or minus, and the formula says 1 minus the cosine of x. Well, what's our cosine of x there? Oops, and I forgot about dividing by 2. Cosine of x there is simply 5/13. Common denominator is going to be 13. So multiply down here by 13, multiply up here by 13. So now we get 13 minus 5. I can subtract my numerators and I get 8 over the common denominator there of 13. And then I can multiply by the reciprocal of what's down here in the denominator. So instead of dividing by 2, I can multiply by the reciprocal, which is 1/2. Don't forget, we got a plus or minus. And so now we're going to get 8 over 26. And then let's go ahead and before we take the square root, let's think in terms of reducing that down. So I can see that 2 definitely goes into 8 and goes into 26, so I get 4/13. And then we want to go ahead and take the square root of the numerator and denominator. The numerator there comes out nicely, so we get 2. Down here in the denominator down there, we get the square root of 13. Can't leave a square root down there in the denominator, so I got to multiply the numerator and denominator by the square root of 13. So really, we end up there with 2 square root of 13. Square root of 13 times the square root of 13 is the square root of 169, which is 13. And remember, this is plus or minus, so we're going to have to make a decision about this. So it says here that x is in the first quadrant. So if x is in the first quadrant, then half of the angle is also going to be, then its half angle is also going to be in quadrant 1. Because again, think about like if you have, I don't know, 50, then 50 divided by 2 is 25, so 25 is also in quadrant 1. So we get 2 square root of 13 all over 13. Tangent. So the half angle for tangent there, again, you get to decide which formula you're going to use for this. We could either use a sine of, we have 2 different formulas here, so completely whichever one you're more comfortable here with. So we could use this one, the sine, because we already found these. Half angle there for sine, the half angle here for cosine. We already found those 2 values. So if I go back there and look, 2 square root of 13 over 13. And then I'm going to go, we already know the cosine down here. We're given that. That's 5. No, it's not. I go back. Was 3 square root of 13 over 13. right? So a half angle there for sine there was 2 square root of 13 over 13. And the half angle there for cosine there was 3 square root of 13 over 13. So remember, we got a division here. We got a single fraction at the top. We got a single fraction at the bottom. So let's rewrite this as a multiplication statement. So you got 2 square root of 13 over 13. And instead of dividing by the fraction down at the bottom down there, we're going to multiply by its reciprocal. So I'm just going to flip this fraction. And then you can look diagonally and see if anything can cross out. And I'm going, oh yeah, square root of 13s can go. And the 13s can go because it's all over multiplication and division. And so then if I multiply my numerators and multiply my denominators, what do I end up getting? I end up getting 2/3. Okay. If you felt more comfortable using one of the tangent formulas, one of the other tangent formulas, you got 2 other ones, you can completely use those. It's up to you which one you wanted to use. So, just your personal preference on those. Alright, so now this one, let's talk about one that's in a different quadrant rather than the third quadrant, or rather than the first quadrant. So this one here is in the third quadrant. The sign there of x is negative 2 square 6 over 5. Let's try this one out. So to be able to find the cosine of x, we got to use that nice Pythagorean identity that we've been using over and over and over again. It's just cosine squared x plus sine squared x equals 1. I'm going to put my sine in there. Cosine, not doing anything with yet. Negative 2 square root of 6 over 5. And we're supposed to square that. Alright, so cosine squared. You've been doing this many times here now, so I'm going to start to move things over on the other side. So this 1, I know I'm going to have to get a common denominator, so I'm going to set it up. So I'm going to do 1 over 1 to kind of set it up to get a common denominator. If I square the numerator here and bring that over here, I'm going to have to subtract it over here. But I'm going to square it. So negative 2 squared, there's 4. The square root of 6 there, square root is 6. And 5 there, square root is 25. So we're going to need a common denominator here of 25. Alright, so hopefully you can see 25 minus 24 up there is 1. And down here is 25. That is what cosine squared is equal to. So now to get rid of that squared, what do we have to do? Take the wonderful square root of both sides. So let's do that. So doing so, I end up there with cosine x is equal to plus or minus square root of 1 there is 1, square root of 25 there is 5. It says that we are down there in quadrant 3. So think about quadrant 3. Well, in quadrant 3, your cosine, remember it's your x value in quadrant 3 there is negative. So this is going to be a negative 1/5. Alright, so now let's go ahead and use our half angle here for cosine. So it is plus or minus the square root of 1 plus the cosine of x, and we just found that to be negative 1/5. And then the other part of the formula says to divide that by 2. Alright, so I'll just keep going with this. Let's get a common denominator. Common denominator up here obviously is going to have to be a 5. So I'm going to have to multiply that 1, which I made 1 over 1. I'm going to multiply these by 5s. And then plus negative 1/5. Divided by 2. And take the square root of that, the whole thing, and don't forget plus or minus. Unless you've already figured that out. So 5 plus a negative 1 up there in the numerator is 4/5. Instead of dividing by 2, I can multiply by the reciprocal. The reciprocal of 2 is 1/2. Multiply my numerators, multiply my denominators, I get 4/10. And then that definitely can be simplified. So let's reduce down that 4/10. 4 there is 2. Or 2 goes in a 4 there twice, 2 goes in a 10 there twice. So I get 2/5. So basically I'm going to get the square root of 2 and the square root of 5. And I can't leave that square root of 5 down there. So I have to multiply my numerator and denominator by the square root of 5. So really we end up here, the square root of 10, the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 25, which is 5. Then we're going to have to make a decision, is this going to be a positive or negative? Well, we're in the third quadrant, alright? So if x is in the third quadrant, what about x over 2? Well, think about it. So if you got an angle down in the third quadrant, something larger than 180, so larger than 180 might be like 200 would be in the third quadrant. If you divide that by 2, that would be 100, and 100 would be in the second quadrant. Right? So since we're going to be in the second quadrant now, we have to think about this. In the second quadrant, is your cosine negative or positive? In the second quadrant, your cosine there is negative. So we're going to end up there with negative square root of 10 over 5. Alright, and the other one over here I wanted to do is this one. So the half angle of sine, we're going to do plus or minus square root of 1 minus the cosine of x. So cosine of x, remember, is negative 1/5. And then we're dividing by 2. So remember, the formula there says to minus, and we have to minus a negative 1/5, which in fact is going to make it a plus. So let's get a common denominator. We know it's going to be 5. So that 1 is going to turn into 5/5. You've got a minus, so it's going to become a plus. And then we're still dividing by 2. So adding my numerators there, writing down my common denominator, multiplying by the reciprocal of 2 is 1/2. So now I'm going to get 6/10. And then before I take the square root, I'm going to reduce down that 6/10. 2 goes into 6 3 times. 2 goes into 10 5 times. I'm going to take the square root now. Still plus minus out here. And cannot leave that square root down in the denominator, so I'm going to have to multiply the numerator and denominator here by the square root of 5. So doing so, down in the denominator there, square root of 5 times square root of 5 is square root of 25, which is 5. The square root of 3 times the square root of 5, those are both square roots. You can multiply them back together, and we get the square root of 15. And then we got to make a decision here. X is in the third quadrant. If X is in the third quadrant, and you do the half angle, so think about something in the third quadrant, so maybe like 220, and you take half of that, you're at 110, whereas 110, that's in the second quadrant. So x over 2 would be in the quadrant 2. So in quadrant 2 is sign there positive or negative in quadrant 2? Oh yeah, my sign in quadrant 2 there is going to be positive. So this is going to be a positive square root of 15/5. Alright, so then these are kind of like what we did yesterday with those other ones. We had double angles, so now think about, is there something that you could take and divide by 2 and that it would give you 22.5? And I'm thinking, oh yeah, we can do that. That would be 45. If I took 45 and I divided by 2, I would get 22.5. Okay, so that's like your half angle there. So we could use the half angle formula then, because your x here would be like your 45 degrees. So following it through, it would be plus or minus the square root one minus the cosine, not x, but a 45, and then divided by 2. What is the cosine of 45? Oh yeah, cosine of 45 is the square root of 2/2. Knowing I'm going to have to get a common denominator over here, I might as well start doing that. It's got to be 2. So then up here, I get 2 minus the square root of 2 over 2. And I'm going to multiply that by the reciprocal of what's down there. So the reciprocal of 2 is 1 over 2. And I still got to take the square of that. So multiply my numerators, multiply my denominators there, I get 2 minus the square root of 2 over 4. And then I got to take the square root of all that. So I keep forgetting my plus or minus here on the outside. So then I could take the square root of the denominator down there, so the square root of 4 down there would be 2. And this would be the square root of 2 minus the square root of 2. And there we go. And plus or minus. So we got to decide if it's plus or minus. So if you take the, if you take 45 degrees and you divide it by 2, you get 22.5. And 22.5 is definitely there in quadrant 1, so it's got to be positive. So that would be our solution. All right, so let's come down here. Let's do one more of these. I'm going to bring this up. So tangent. Again, you get to decide which formula you want to use for tangent since you've got 3 choices here. So tangent here, I'm just going to use 1 minus, actually I'm going to write this out first. So let's say like this. The tangent, again, we got to think about 22.5. What divided by 2 is going to give you 22.5, and it's got to be 45. So follow your half angle formula through. It says 1 minus the cosine of x, which in this case is 45, divided by the sine of 45. Alright, we know that the cosine of 45 there is the square root of 2 over 2. And we know that the sine of 45 there is the square root of 2 over 2. So up there in the numerator, go ahead and get a nice common denominator. So multiply by 2, multiply by 2. So we end up here in the numerator here with 2 minus the square root of 2 over 2 times the reciprocal. The reciprocal of the square root of 2 over 2 is 2 over the square root of 2. Looking diagonally there, I can see these plain 2's here can cancel out to 1's. So then we end up here with 2 minus the square root of 2 over the square root of 2. I don't usually leave the square root of 2 down here in the denominator, so I'm going to multiply the numerator and denominator by the square root of 2. So what do we end up getting? Down here, the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is the square root of 4, which is 2. I could distribute the 2 through up there in the numerator there, so I can multiply there, So I'm going to do that. So I get 2 square root of 2 minus square root of 2 times square root of 2 is square root of 4, which is 2. So now hopefully you can see every single term there has a 2 in it, right? So I'm going to pull a 2 out of the numerator up there. So if I do, I get the square root of 2 minus 1 over 2. Those cross out. And so really what I end up there with is just the square root of 2 minus 1. And this one here, I didn't have to worry about that plus or minus. So you can work on the 4/6 half angle identities worksheet for your assignment.